There, I think we have people joining us. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 2022 Griffith and Patricia Way lecture, Line of Advantage, Japan's Grand Strategy in the Era of Abe Shinzō, with Michael J. Green of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'm Ellen Eskenazi, Associate Director of the University of Washington Japan Studies Program. Our program is a campus-wide program spanning several units in the College of Arts and Sciences and professional schools at the University of Washington. So I'm very happy you've joined us this evening. And before we begin, I have just a few housekeeping items to mention. This event will be recorded so that folks who couldn't make it this evening will be able to see Michael's talk at a later date. We will be making that available online on our website within a few days. So if you want to check back to the UW Japan Studies site, you can always see it again. And then I did want to let you know that coming up on May 6th at 3:30 p.m. Pacific Time, we are hosting an in-person talk with Saori Katada of the University of Southern California. And she will be giving a presentation entitled Japan's Geoeconomic Strategy in the Indo-Pacific. So we hope you can join us in person on campus in Seattle, and there's more information on our website again. Our moderator this evening is Sadia Pekkanen of the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies. And we will be collecting questions via the QA function of the webinar. So if you have questions related to the talk, please enter them for our panelists to see. And at this time, I would like to introduce Marie Antradogi, Chair of the UW and also Jackson School of Japan Study Programs. Marie?
Well, thank you, Ellen. Greetings to all of you this evening. As Ellen said, I'm Marie Antradogi, a professor in the Japan Studies program at UW's Jackson School. We're very glad that you were able to join us tonight for this annual Griffith and Patricia Way lecture. We're continuing to do it remotely this year, but I wanted you to know that next year we expect to be back in person and hope to have maybe a live streaming option too. But due to uncertainties, we felt this was the best way to go this year. Well, Pat passed away in 2020 and Griff in 2018. I'm sure that they are both with us in spirit this evening. And we're joined by members of their family, including their daughter, Susan Way, and her husband, Clark Sorensen, and their son, Bill Way, and his wife, Mary Way. Through the generous support of friends and the Way family, our endowed lecture is now in its 15th year. While much of the world's attention has turned towards the rise of China, obviously the Russia-Ukraine war, the Way Lecture Series allows us to have a major community event every year focused on some aspect of Japan. For those of you who are not familiar with the Ways, let me just say a little bit about them. They were lifelong advocates of supporting and promoting knowledge and appreciation of all things Japanese, from literature and art to politics and law. And they did this through individual efforts and also through many organizations. Griff was a native of Seattle whose adult life revolved around Japan after he served as a Japanese interpreter and translator in the Navy during World War II. His language skills ultimately helped save thousands of lives during the invasion of Tinian Island in the Mariana Islands. Among other distinctions, Griff helped create UW's Asia Law program in the early 1960s, and he was a UW Law School Distinguished Alumni Award recipient. Griff served on the board of the Seattle Art Museum for a long time and was the founding trustee on the board of the Blakemore Foundation, which gives grants for the advanced study of Asian languages and to art museums. Griff also served long on the board of the Journal of Japanese Studies. In fact, he was involved in the founding of the journal here in Seattle in the early 1970s. He was on the Jackson School Visiting Committee for decades and has been a trusted advisor for all of us who have run the UW Japan Studies program. Pat was also raised in Seattle. She's a UW graduate, but her education was interrupted when she was selected by the Navy to attend a very highly regarded Japanese language training school in Boulder, Colorado. Griff had also been selected for this very competitive program, and on the train to Colorado, they met, and the rest is history. Griff was sent to Asia, as I said, but Pat spent the war in Washington, D.C., serving in the Office of Naval Intelligence and Naval Communications. They married in 1946 and were married for almost 73 years. Along the road, they acquired an extensive collection of modern Japanese paintings and prints, which have toured many museums in Japan and the US. And our community now enjoys many of these pieces as part of Seattle Art Museum's permanent collection. Griff and Pat are major role models for us all, and not just for all of their contributions to the study of Japan. They were people of exceptional integrity, empathy, generosity, and humility, and they remain great sources of inspiration. In short, many people's lives were enriched by their vision and generosity, and my hope is that this lecture series helps keep their legacy alive. At this time, I want to call on my colleague, Sadia Pekkanen. She's professor of international relations of Japan and Asia in the Jackson School. She also holds the Job and Gertrude Tamaki Endowed Professorship, and she will introduce tonight's distinguished speaker.
Thank you so much, Marie. Mike, welcome to the University of Washington. I want to thank all of you for attending. It is my great pleasure to introduce Mike Green, one of the luminaries in the field of Japan studies, a person whose work we turn to for helping us think about where Japan is in the world and where it might be headed. It is very difficult to do justice to the scope of his work, as he's one of those rare Japan hands who has really bridged academia and the policy world so effortlessly. He makes it look easy, the writing, the public service, and the engagement. So I want to step back and give you a mere sweep of his many, many accomplishments. Mike received his PhD in international relations from Johns Hopkins, was a Fulbright graduate research fellow at the University of Tokyo, and received his BA in history with the highest honors from Kenyon College. He's associate professor at Georgetown University, directing both the Asian Studies program and holding the chair in modern and contemporary Japanese politics and foreign policy. He is also senior vice president for Asia, Japan chair, and Henry A. Kissinger chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He has worked at the National Security Council, serving as special assistant to the president for national security affairs and as senior director for Asian affairs, work which gave him a front seat to engagement with Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, as well as East Asia and South Asia more broadly. He's on the board of trustees of the Asia Foundation, a member of the Aspen Strategy Group and the Council on Foreign Relations, where he was previously also a senior fellow for East Asian security. He's about to begin a next chapter in his life. He will be the new CEO for the United States Studies Center at the University of Sydney. And Mike, as I was reviewing your work today, a decade or so ago, you wrote a chapter on strategic triangles for our Oxford Handbook on the International Relations of Asia, as a way of describing what you saw going on in terms of agenda setting and problem solving and alliance building in Asia in a trilateral context. And as I was reviewing what you have done today, I thought to myself, you yourself have really become a strategic node of your own research triangle covering the United States, Japan, and Australia, right at the heart of it all. Mike's scholarship is extraordinary. Among other things, he has 6 edited books and 4 single-authored books to date. These books have built one on the other to give us a clear composite picture of Japan as we knew it in the 1980s to where Japan is headed in the 21st century. What kind of Japan are we talking about? What is the same? What has changed? Who has changed it, and with what consequences? These are important questions at a time of great changes in Asia and the world. And the times require a grand strategy, whether you think you are a middle or a great power. No book, to my mind, perhaps captures Japan's trajectories here quite like the one he's here to talk to us about and that just came out. The title, I think, says it all. The book is Line of Advantage, Japan's Grand Strategy in the Era of Abe Shinzō. Mike, over to you and welcome again to the University of Washington.
Well, thank you very much, Sadi. I'm glad you're recording this because I want to play that back for my wife when she gets home a little later. That was very generous. And thank you, Marie. And I really actually appreciated very much hearing about the Wei family. My previous book was called By More Than Providence. It was a huge 8-year endeavor, and it was a history of American strategic approaches to Asia since 1783. Since Thomas Jefferson first wrote a letter saying we have to be a Pacific power when we win our independence. And that book was a long book, it was 700 pages. What propelled the book and propelled the story and what really tells the story of American engagement is the story of families like the Wei family, which is not in my book, but I really appreciated hearing about them because and I tell my students this at Georgetown, you have agency. You become an expert on Japan, on China, Korea. You can, in our field, you can shape trends in history in a way that is really unique because we, the United States, are so increasingly dependent on what happens in Asia. And in spite of the phenomenal pedagogy and teaching of Sadia and her husband and others at University of Washington and my colleagues at Georgetown and elsewhere, we don't have enough experts. We don't have enough people. So the Wei family is a great example of how exciting the history of American engagement is because it's families like that that just had an enormous impact throughout history. So I was really glad you were able to do that. And I'm proud to be part of this lecture series. My last book, which I published in 2017, was a history of American grand strategy towards Asia. It was a big, ambitious book. No one had written a book on the topic for 100 years, literally. The last one was in 1920, and it was huge fun. And I have found my sort of sweet spot as a scholar or practitioner is thinking about countries' grand strategies and approaches to the region. So I did the US and then I returned to my Japan roots for this current book, which I have strategically placed over my shoulder. It's called Line of Advantage, and it's the story of Japan's grand strategy in the era of Abe Shinzō. And like a lot of my previous books, I never colored inside the lines when I was a kid. So I was a history undergrad major, a political scientist as a PhD student, and then I had policy jobs in the Pentagon and the White House. And the work that I enjoy and find most interesting and I hope useful merges the three. And so I'm, for the PhD students in the room, I'm trained as a political scientist and a historian. So I kind of cheat. Most of my books, if you look at them, are political science approaches, but the case studies are completely chronological. So it also happens to be a history. And we're looking at, in my books, the dependent and independent variables over time. And if you're interested in statecraft and grand strategy, that's how you have to think. You have to think, when I was in the White House for 5 years with other political scientists like Condi Rice from Stanford at that time, Peter Fever from Duke, Victor Cha from Georgetown, trained as political scientists, we didn't use political science to do policy. It shaped our assumptions, but we needed to use history and political science in unison to understand how we got where we are, what the choices were, what worked and didn't work, what explained failure and success, how contingency and time, temporal factors affect the interaction of states with the system. And so marrying history and political science, the political science provides the rigor, the history provides the intuition to understand the course of events. Combining those is the best way to write a book that hopefully is scholarly in its impact, but also helps policymakers, which to me is important. It's partly why I got into this. So the current book on Japan, it tries to do that. And it looks at Japan's grand strategy in the era of Abe Shinzō, the longest serving Japanese prime minister, someone I can call a friend. I worked with, he was my counterpart when I was in the White House, who I know pretty well. I wanted to try to explain Japan's grand strategy. And with my previous book, I had to explain how a democracy can be capable of grand strategy. People think of grand strategy as something done by Thucydides or Metternich or Lord Castlereagh or maybe Henry Kissinger. And democracies, including Japan's and the United States, are messy, contested, with checks and balances. And so the first thing I had to grapple with in this series of books I've written is how do democracies do grand strategies? And the fact is democracies do grand strategies. And often in a sloppy, undisciplined, inconsistent, and hypocritical way, but with impact. Democracies shape their regions, shape their system with intent, despite the contestation and so forth. When I was a PhD student, I assume Sadia as well, most people assumed Japan's grand strategy was all about technology and economics, which was largely true. The Japanese strategic approach after the war was to avoid risky national security or geopolitical issues, focus on economic development and engagement with the world through commerce. That changed. It changed when the Japanese economy slowed down in the 90s. It changed with the rise of China and a much more contested geopolitical space. And so this is a book about grand strategy in the era of Abe Shinzō. And under Abe, I argue, Japan and the Japanese government and the Japanese Diet consolidated an approach to Asia at a time of rising Chinese power and some growing uncertainty about American commitment, and did so in a way that is enduring. The earlier framework that most scholars use to think of Japan's role in the world in the post-war era was called the Yoshida Doctrine, named ex post facto by scholars after the approach set by Yoshida Shigeru, family name Yoshida. Yoshida Shigeru, the first and dominant post-war prime minister in Japan, who allied with the United States, but avoided major military risks, commitments, and spending, and focused wisely on economic recovery. And that Yoshida Doctrine dominated Japanese government's approaches to the United States and Asia for 6 decades. Abe's new grand strategy represents a new chapter for Japan, a Japanese approach that is about shaping the environment, taking risks, being proactive, being assertive, engaging in balance of power and grand strategies of states that are not thought of as pacifist states like post-war Japan. And the premise of the book, and I think most Japanese diplomatic historians and international relations scholars agree with this, but the premise of the book is that we are now in a new chapter that will last a generation in all likelihood, of a strategic approach that's much more assertive and proactive and based on willing to take more risk than the previous Yoshida Doctrine. And it's a strategy for a generation. It will change, depending on the prime minister, but it will be a bit like the American strategy of containment in the Cold War. It changed from president to president, crises arose, adjustments were made, but the general premise that we would compete with the Soviet Union, contain them, continued throughout the Cold War. And the Japanese strategy for Asia now is largely set, I would argue. I say in the book, and I title the book, in the era of Abe Shinzō, grand strategy in the era of Abe Shinzō, because it is not just Abe Shinzō's grand strategy. And I'll describe the strategy in a moment. Abe consolidated it, brought it together when he came back to power for his second term as prime minister in late 2012. He pulled together strings. He used his political mandate to really create the legislative and national security establishment and budgetary framework. But the strategy itself began taking shape in the 90s. I wrote a book that I published in 2000 called Japan's Reluctant Realism, which argued that our earlier understanding of Japan, that it would focus on economic issues and avoid traditional balance of power strategies of great states, was probably wrong. That with the collapse of Japanese economic growth, with the rising uncertainty about China, which you could always already see in the mid-1990s, that Japan as a country was reluctantly, hence the title, reluctantly becoming more realist. Not realistic necessarily, but realist, meaning in international relations theory terms, focused on balance of power strategies, on strengthening the alliance with the US, on trying outreach to Russia, other ways to shape the external environment and preserve Japan's interests in an increasingly uncertain environment, uncertain because of Japan's own now limited economic growth, but the external uncertainty because of China after the Cold War. And I called that book Reluctant Realism. A subtitle for this book might be Reluctant No More. This is a pronounced balance of power strategy by Japan. And so I call it, grand strategy in the era of Abe Shinzō because the strands really started to come together in the 90s. I worked in the Pentagon. I go in and out of government and academia. I get to see in the policy world if my ideas are right. Some of my critics have accused me of coming up with academic theories and then going to work at the Pentagon or the White House to make them happen to prove that I was right. I'm not that powerful, despite the very gracious introduction from Sadia. I don't have that kind of omniscience and superpower. But I was in the Pentagon in the 90s, late 90s, working on Japan and Asia, and could see clearly the changes in the Japanese approach to security even then, but still reluctant realism. Pacifism had a very powerful hold on Japan. The idea of taking on more risk to shape the security environment around Japan was quite contested. But now, reluctant no more. And the book tries to capture Abe's role, but it goes before Abe, as I said, to the 90s. And I also argue that it actually goes even further back. And so I began the historical inquiry for this book in the 9th century, and with the earliest recorded texts in Japan, Nihon Koki, the Chronicles of Japan, which were the first recorded histories that we have, where Japanese intellectuals tried to explain, with a mix of mythology and contemporary at the time, geopolitics, how Japan fit. What was Japan? How did Japan relate to China? How did Japan relate to the rest of Asia? So I went way back before the 90s. It's only a 350-page book, so I didn't go in too much detail, but I went back to sort of trace some of the strategic evolution in Japanese thinking. And I did that because in our field, in the Japan studies field, so much of the examination of Japan's security policies have been myopic historically, have looked at the post-war period, and have tended to frame Japan's growing realism, growing debate about security as essentially a kind of dialectic or binary debate. On the one hand, the powerful pacifist tradition of post-war Japan. On the other hand, this sort of desire for it to be a quote unquote normal country, not pacifist, not held back. And there's certainly a lot to that framing, but the problem with it is it doesn't give any agency to Japan within Asia. It's entirely domestic and internal, and it doesn't look at history before Article 9 and post-war pacifism. So I wanted to sort of provide some broader historical sweep to show that the strategic consensus that's emerged in Japan is one that has much deeper historical roots. And so in the opening chapter of the book, I look at the strategic history in Japan, and going back to Nihon Koki and the early efforts by Japanese intellectuals to define their island nation and their emperor in the context of a Sinocentric system in Asia. And then really looked a lot at the Tokugawa and Meiji eras as Japan, came out of isolation in a world dominated by imperial powers and maritime powers like Britain and the United States. And I focus a lot in that chapter on Sakamoto Ryoma, who was one of the Meiji leaders who pulled together the Satsuma and Choshu clans to basically overthrow the Tokugawa shogunate. And Sakamoto Ryoma is a wonderful historical figure. He was a master swordsman, believed in Bushido. I have a black belt in EI. I did sword. And so I studied him for years, but Sakamoto believed that Tokugawa shogunate was being too weak in opening and trying to adopt Western ideas. So he traveled to Edo, the capital, to assassinate the man who he saw as one of the leading architects of accepting Western learning, who was another samurai named Katsu Kaishu, who was the first sea captain of the Tokugawa Navy, who captained the Isshin Maru, the ship that brought the first delegation to the United States, who designed Japan's Navy and studied the British and American navies. And so Sakamoto went to kill him, to chop his head off. But when he met Katsu Kaishu, he was so overwhelmed by Katsu's strategic brilliance and knowledge of naval shipbuilding and naval engineering that instead of killing him, he became his student, as a professor, my first line of defense is to wow my students with brilliance so they don't kill me, but I also have a black belt and sword if that doesn't work. So anyway, Katsu Kaishu taught Sakamoto, who became an adherent to this idea that Japan should be a commercial, cosmopolitan, maritime power. And in his 8 points to the Emperor Meiji, he proposed that Japan essentially be like Britain, a major maritime power. And I discuss this history because one way to look at Japanese history is that there were other paths Japan might have taken in the pre-war years. And one of them might have been a more maritime, more cosmopolitan strategic path. But of course that didn't happen for a variety of reasons we can go into if you like. But instead not the Choshu clan, not the Navy, not the internationalists, not the Satsuma, the maritime clan and the Navy and the internationalists, but Choshu, the army and the militarists dominated for a variety of reasons. And historians in Japan like Yokibe Makoto have argued the big tragedy of Japan's pre-war strategy was Japan as a maritime power chose to invade China and the continent, which brought them ruin. And as I traced this history through the post-war years and looked at scholars, Kosaka Masataka and others, trying to find a way for Japan to shape its external environment, a line of advantage, Rieki-sen, is a Meiji-era term which Yamagata Aritomo used to explain to his compatriots that Japan could no longer just close itself and defend itself at its shores. It had to shape the environment, find its line of advantage, and keep foes far away. The army and the militarists decided the way to do that was to invade Korea, then Manchuria, then China. But the other way would have been maritime. And so post-war intellectuals who tried to recapture some realism, some sense that Japan could shape its environment, Kosaka Masataka of Kyoto University, who I studied under briefly, tried to bring up this maritime strategy. And I mention all this history because when you look at Abe's grand strategy and the words he uses and the terms of his strategy, it's Sakamoto Ryoma, it's Katsu Kaishu, it's post-war scholars like Kosaka Masataka. It's a maritime strategy. It's Japan as the Britain of Asia, not the Germany, but the Britain, a maritime power, responsible, depending on the seas and free commerce and open-based, rules-based order. This is how Abe frames his strategy, and it resonates. And that matters. Now, to some extent, that's cover to sort of, critics would say, distract people from Japan's militarist past. But it's not fake. This is a real strategic tradition in Japan that Abe and his fellow LDP leaders have tried to bring back. And then this goes to the other argument in the book, which is, in many ways, because of this maritime strategic approach, Japan's grand strategy today, Japan's approach to a rising China, I argue, is the most influential strategy in the world on the United States. And not just on the United States, but on Britain, on Australia, on India, and I think now on Korea. We have this historic special relationship in the United States with Britain, this, NATO, World War I, World War II, NATO, the Cold War. The special relationship that will define American strategy in the next century is going to be with Japan. The level of our intelligence cooperation, our history of fighting together with the British and the Australians and the Five Eyes, Canada and New Zealand, is deep and rich and a long tradition. But the strategic thinking that's most influential in Washington is Japan's now. And it's the maritime strategy, because America has its own maritime strategy tradition that we are returning to. as is Australia and the other dominions, Canada and India and the British. And the evidence is pretty clear. When Donald Trump became president, he essentially had no Asia strategy. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson was going to give a speech at CSIS, and the Japanese head of policy planning from the Gaimusho, the foreign ministry, visited with his counterpart in the State Department and described Abe's new strategy in 2017, which he called the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. And the State Department official literally said, can we use that? And a month later at CSIS, Rex Tillerson gave a speech saying, we will have a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. And when President Biden got elected, his political advisor said, you can't call it the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy anymore, that's Trump. But the Japanese embassy talked to Kurt Campbell and other senior officials and said, it's not Trump, it's Abe. And Biden agreed. So now Biden calls it the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. That is our strategy. What are the key elements? The Quad, the US, Japan, Australia, India quadrilateral grouping. That was Abe's proposal. Infrastructure financing, that was Abe's proposal. Investing in ASEAN resilience, that was Abe's proposal. So the Japanese strategic thinking about how to deal with the rising China, how to reinforce the region against Chinese coercion, it's very, very influential. The only thing I point out to Mr. Abe and his friends is, if you read my previous book, the Quad, you know who thought of the Quad? Alfred Thayer Mahan, an American strategist, 120 years ago. Free and open, that's American. So these are American concepts that we strayed away from as we withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as we sort of were a bit confused. And now we're coming back to them because Japan is reminding us. And then British friends remind me, actually, it wasn't Mahan. It actually goes back to British maritime thinking in the 17th century. So we can keep going back to the Vikings. But it is a maritime strategy tradition, and it is a view of alignment and protecting a free and open Indo-Pacific that resonates now, really strongly resonates in a lot of capitals. So what is the strategy? A little bit more on that, Sadia, and then I'm happy to take questions. So here I found my basic international relations theory training quite useful. How does a country formulate a strategy when you face a suddenly dramatically rising power like China? In 2010, Japan was still the number 2 economy. Today, China's the number 2 economy. In 2010, Japan's maritime self-defense forces were bigger than the PLA Navy. Now the PLA Navy is, depending on how you count, 3 or 4 times bigger. So it's a dramatic, obvious shift in power. So what do you do under international relations theory? What would Kenneth Waltz say? Well, when you face such a dramatic deterioration in your position in the external balance of power, you have 3 options. One option, as your grad students should know, is bandwagoning. You can join Team China. Resistance is futile. We're not going to resist. That, Sadia will remember this, but there were people in the 90s, scholars arguing that that's what Japan would do. It would align with China in the future. It's not happening. And I don't think it's going to happen. And Abe, in his first speech, after he came back as prime minister in the US, it was at CSIS, I hosted him. He looked at the audience and he said, Japan is not now and will never be a tier 2 country. So Japan will compete. It's not going to bandwagon with China. There were some parties in the early 90s, Sakigake, who advocated kind of not fighting, not resisting. We got a lot of money, let's just retire. Who cares if China's in charge? You don't hear that now. You don't hear it from any party, not even the Communist Party, which is one of the most anti-China parties in Japan right now. So that option is really not on the table anymore. So then if you're not going to do bandwagoning, just give up and join Team China, then the other options are balance of power. Somehow you have to restore a balance of power to maintain your interests. And there are 2 ways you can do it, theoretically. One is internal balancing, your own unilateral power and strength. And structural realists and hardcore realists think this is the most obvious way to go. So for example, John Mearsheimer at University of Chicago predicts Japan will develop nuclear weapons because that's the fastest way to basically restore deterrence and balance of power when you face a situation like Japan does. But Japan's not doing that. Japan could develop nuclear weapons probably in a year, has the technology. But for a maritime country connected to the world economically, not an option. For North Korea, maybe, but not. Japan does not have the option of becoming a pariah state in pursuit of internal balancing, military balancing. Instead, Abe has pursued internal balancing, strengthening Japan's indigenous power. And there are two ways people think about internal balancing. There's quantitative balancing, which is actual material strength. And what Abe has done is the economy. So his famous Abenomics. I had lunch with Abe in 2013 in the Prime Minister's office, and he said 70% of his time is being spent on the economy. He when he was first Prime Minister, he made the mistake of not remembering it's the economy, stupid. But it's the economy. It's a source of his political strength, but also Japan's geopolitical strength. Now, if Sadia Pekkanen were designing Japan's Abenomics, I'm guessing Sadia would do it a little differently than Abe did. I think it would probably involve more structural reform, more freeing up competition. Abe did it in a different way. He sort of deregulated selectively tourism, the stock market, and squeezed growth out of Japan. Not as much as could have been done with a more sweeping set of structural reforms, but some growth. And economic growth is power. It's quantitative balancing. He also increased the defense budget so that it's now over 1%. With supplementals, it's at 1.3% of GDP this year. And introduced new weapon systems, converted Japan's helicopter carriers to aircraft carriers that can carry F-35Bs. So some significant, but not, for the rest of Asia, not shocking or disturbing increases in material power. The other kind of internal balancing that is possible is qualitative internal balancing, which is to say, it's not about the means, but the ways. How do you use what you have? And here Abe was very influential, building on ideas that had been debated for years and creating basically Japan's first post-war national security state. You know, I taught at the National War College, and what every lieutenant colonel is taught is, and you hear it now in the debate about Ukraine and why the Russians are doing badly, that unity of purpose is power. If you align what you have behind one purpose, if you're Ukraine and you're outnumbered 10 to 1 by the Russians, if you're using your stuff well, if you have a central strategy and you're deploying what you have effectively, you can win. And Abe introduced real unity of purpose and unity of command in Japanese national security policymaking. Now, a lot of this depends on the leader. You know, the US has a very well-established national security state. But if the leader doesn't use it, it's not going to be effective. But Abe created it and he used it effectively. So probably most important in this qualitative internal balancing was creation of a National Security Council system like the US has. And changing the rules, the laws that govern the role of the cabinet and cabinet secretary to create a more presidential style command authority for the prime minister's office. So that to compete with China, which is what this is about, you know, he could make sure that intelligence was shared, make sure that the trade ministry and foreign ministry and defense ministry were all working towards the same purpose. So the National Security Council system, aligning the military services closer together, the Coast Guard and the Navy, aligning Japan's instruments of national power, bureaucracies. You know, when Sadia and I were studying this as grad students, at least I was taught that stovepipes, or what some people in Washington sarcastically call cylinders of excellence, but stovepipes are very Japanese. You know, that of course Meti and Gaimusho are going to fight each other constantly. Of course, I mean, Karl von Wolfram and all the books we read in the 80s and 90s were all about the headless state. And there was a long, long history of this in Japan, of clans, and then Navy versus Army in World War II, and then Meti versus Foreign Ministry. And a lot of people, including me, thought a lot of this was culturally determined. It wasn't. You know, competition, external structural factors can change political cultures. And Abe really broke down a lot of stovepiping and created unity of purpose in this qualitative internal balancing. And then the last thing that a country can do to maintain a balance of power is what theorists call external balancing, which is not about your own material power, but aligning with other countries, building a team. You know, you may not be as strong, but you've got friends, and Japan has friends. Japan now in Asia outside of China and Korea is by far the most popular country in the world. In some surveys in Southeast Asia, Japan consistently gets over 90% favorability ratings. Japan built friendships. Abe went to every ASEAN country within the first few months of his premiership, cementing relationships with leaders. He championed the Quad, U.S., Japan, Australia, India Quad, which President Biden elevated to a summit. He focused on the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, which was primarily a strategy to compete with China's Belt and Road by offering comparable amounts of finance assistance from Japan's Bank for International Cooperation, but with much better terms and much more, debt sustainability and more environmentally friendly and more transparent, what the Japanese called high quality infrastructure. And trade, shaping the norms and the rules. When Abe came to power, about 16% of Japan's trade was covered by trade agreements like Trans-Pacific Partnership and RCEP and so forth, about 16%. When he left office, it was close to 85%. So just a remarkable transformation, which is the main topic of Saori Katata's outstanding book, which you'll have her speak. It tells that story about this just transformation in Japan's political economy. It's a great book, remarkable story. But in my world, that's shaping the strategic environment, rulemaking, making Southeast Asia resilient against Chinese coercion. Perhaps the most important external balancing that Abe did was with the United States. And that was to revise Japan's official interpretation of Article 9 of the Constitution. Article 9 states Japan renounces the right of war. And unilaterally, the Japanese Cabinet Legislative Bureau, which rules on the constitutionality of legislation, determined decades ago that although the UN Charter states that all countries have the right of individual defense, defending themselves if they're attacked, or collective defense, working with others and defending others collectively, although all countries have that right, in the spirit of the Constitution, Japan will not exercise the right of collective self-defense, meaning that Japan will not come to the defense of the US or Australia or Korea or Taiwan or anyone else. And what that meant was Japan had a perfect alibi. So when the Vietnam War came along, the Japanese government could say, we'd love to help you with your little war in Vietnam, but the Constitution, which you Americans wrote, we believe means we can't do anything, terribly sorry. But we'd be very happy to repair your equipment. And Japan made billions on the Vietnam War. So it was a get out of jail free card. It was an alibi to avoid entrapment in American Cold Wars, to have American protection without any risk. Abe changed that. He changed the interpretation, passed legislation through the Diet, 120 contentious hours of debate on the Diet floor, and changed it so that Japan now has, under some restrictions, but has the right of will exercise the right of collective self-defense. That means that for the first time in the history of our alliance, US and Japanese officials can plan what we would do if China attacked Korea or Taiwan or the South China Sea. We could never do that before. It also means the alibi is gone. Every Japanese prime minister now, like every Australian prime minister or British prime minister, will have to be in the room when the American president decides whether or not to use force. It's transformational. It means Japan's prime ministers are on the hook now. They can't say, I don't know what's going on with the Americans. It's huge. And the reason Abe had to do it was because Japan is no longer in the rear area. It's in the front lines with North Korean missiles, with Chinese ships, and they need us in, and they need to plan, and they need to deter. So this was a critical part. There were two aspects of the external balancing strategy that failed, that were not successful. One was Russia. Abe tried to play the Putin card. Didn't work. He tried to use the Russia card against China. Didn't work. And now Kishida has sanctioned Putin and his cronies, and it's remarkable. We could talk about it, how Japan has stepped up on Ukraine, both for geopolitical reasons, but because of public sentiment against Russia. The other external balancing strategy that, it's not that it failed, it's that Japan didn't even try, was Korea. Historically, the Korean Peninsula was the dagger aimed at the heart of Japan, the most important geopolitical space in Asia for Japan. But under Abe, the fact was the Japanese were basically sick of Korea, made very little effort diplomatically, had some reason to be upset with the Korean side, which pulled out of various bilateral agreements. But it was a huge flaw in the strategy, because Korea is the most important part of Asia for Japan. And that may change now. The new Korean government's more conservative, more willing to work with Japan, so that part might change. But the Japanese side was not, just assumed Korea was lost, that South Korea was lost to China, which if you're an American and you've worked on the US-Korea alliance, you know is not true. But in Tokyo, there was this assumption that Korea's gone. They're bandwagoning with China. That was the assumption. President Yoon in Korea is going to change that, I hope. So that's the strategy. It's pretty cohesive. It's pretty coherent. Nobody is challenging it. In the election in Japan last year, nobody challenged that fundamental strategy, not even the opposition Constitutional Democratic Party. There will be differences based on the prime minister. There'll be different emphases. There'll be debates, but it's a strategy that has more cohesion and support than the strategies of the United States, of India, of Germany, of Britain. And so Japan has a kind of first mover advantage as we figure out how to deal with China. It's had a huge influence on the US in the fact that both Trump and Biden have embraced huge parts of the strategy. And I'll end by saying it's going to have a huge influence going forward, because the piece of the American strategy right now in the Indo-Pacific that's missing is the how do we live with China part. If you read the strategic documents out of the administration, there's no vision for how we live with China. Yes, we'll compete, but to what end? What does a relationship with China look like if we're successful? The Japanese are debating that, and the Australians. And so I think they're going to continue to have a major influence. So if you're interested in China, study Japan, because that's where our strategy is heading. So thank you, Sadia. Thank you, Mari. I'm happy to answer questions or proceed as you like. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mike. That was a wonderful overview of where Japan has been, how it's got to where it is, and where you think it is going. We already have some questions. Your talk and your book raised so many questions for me. Let me begin by asking you a general one. And since you're a national security professional, you're probably aware of red cell thinking, which is if you say X, I'm going to say Y, and get you to consider some things that I want to put on the table for you, because I think you're in a perfect position to be able to answer them. Much of the narrative of your book, as well as your talk, is a very China-centric strategy for Japan, and that it's in a balance of power mode because of China. And I don't think that you'll find many arguments there. But I wonder if I can ask you what also you think the strategic thinking of the Japanese is about the United States, and how that factors into the way that they are balancing or not balancing China at any particular moment. I think that this is important. That's sort of the big, one big question. The other big question, I think, that's also part of this, I think, is, of course, we're now in a post-Ukraine world. And in the post-Ukraine world, what do you see as the prospects for alignment going forward, as there are some concerns in Tokyo? Oh God, you know, we are once again sort of shifting away from a focus on Asia to the European theater, so to speak. Does that factor into the way that Japan may tailor its strategy with respect to China as well? So why don't we open the conversation there, and then we'll take other questions and engage forward from there. Thank you so much, Mike.
Great questions, really interesting questions. Red cells always give me the chills, because I worked in the White House in the Bush administration, and after 9/11, where we were completely surprised, candidly, we kept getting red cells. What would we do if this? What about that? And so I always cringe, because we would be bombarded with them, because we had not been thinking out of the box about terrorists with box cutters. And it's a really important exercise. So Japanese thinking about the US. So I was in the White House during the Bush-Koizumi relationship, and Koizumi had a pragmatic and realistic view that the US alliance was important, but he also had a very sentimental view. It was sentimental. The first time he met President Bush at Camp David, he said, in Japanese, he said, Mr. President, my feeling about the US-Japan alliance could be summarized in the words of Elvis Presley. And then he switched to English and started singing, I need you, I love you. Koizumi had this sentimental view of the alliance. Abe does not. Abe has and so do a lot of Japanese leaders now, I think, the next generation, more of a hard, cold, calculating view of the United States. One of my favorite quotes about the US as a partner is from the British Foreign Secretary in the 80s, Lord Carrington, and at a meeting of the Europeans, reportedly, when everyone was complaining about the Reagan administration and the Americans and unilateralism and all the usual stuff, Lord Carrington turned to all his European counterparts and said, yes, yes, everything you say about the Americans is true, but they're the only Americans we have. And that essentially was Abe's and the Japanese government's view of the US, even Trump. Abe was told shortly before the 2016 election that Trump had a 30% chance of winning, and he was stunned. He couldn't believe it. But instead of being horrified like the Europeans, he started thinking, how do we get Trump on side? And so, one of my favorite sort of images, favorite's not the right word, one of the most compelling images of the Trump years is that famous G7 meeting photo. I wish I had a slide where all the Europeans, Trump's sitting at the table, President Trump, and he's got his arms crossed, and he's got a look like my daughter. I'm not going to eat my broccoli. He just got this look, and Macron and Trudeau and all the Europeans are pointing at him and yelling at him, and standing in between the Europeans and Canadians and Trump is Abe, looking worried and trying, his hands out, saying, ho, ho, ho. Abe lectured the Europeans, don't bait Donald Trump. Don't corner Donald Trump. We need the Americans. And so actually, when Obama was president, polls were very interesting about the US because the Japanese had concerns about President Obama too in different ways. In Yomiuri Shimbun and other polls, when the Japanese public was asked, how important is the US-Japan alliance to Japan? Very high numbers, highest ever. But when asked the question, can you count on the United States to do the right thing? The number was going down. 35, 40% said we could trust the US to do the right thing. And so the Abe approach to the United States is not like the European approach pre-Ukraine. Abe's view was, we don't have the luxury of complaining about the Americans publicly. We need to lock the Americans in. So Trump played multiple rounds of golf with Abe. And I remember one meeting where somebody said to a senior foreign ministry official, my goodness, Abe's had 18 meetings with Trump. And the Japanese official said, no, actually, Abe's had the same meeting 18 times with Donald Trump. So he kept pulling him back. You need to be engaged. You need to be engaged in Asia. And fortunately for the Japanese in the Trump administration, they had some very, very willing strategic partners. H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor, Secretary of Defense Mattis. There were a lot of people in the Trump administration who got it. And the Japanese government very skillfully built coalitions in the US to keep the alliance strong, to keep the US engaged in Asia. So they worry about us. But I think the consensus in Tokyo, I would argue, is they don't think they have the luxury of whining about the United States. They need to make Asia safer with the United States. And then on the post-Ukraine world, it's really interesting. I was sent with some other former officials, a bipartisan group by the Biden administration, to Taiwan in March after the invasion to talk to the Taiwanese leadership, Tsai Ing-wen and others, expressing US support for Taiwan and carrying a message from President Biden that the US would not pivot away from Asia because of Ukraine. We would, and furthermore, arguing that the Ukraine invasion has created an alignment of Europe, of NATO, of Japan, of Australia that is powerful for Taiwan. And although some commentators in Japan have had a very simplistic view that the US is going to abandon Japan to focus on Ukraine, I think wiser heads have prevailed. And as Foreign Minister Hayashi put it about Ukraine, China's watching. Mm-hmm. And the ability of Japan in particular, but also Australia and now increasingly Korea, Singapore, interestingly, and NATO allies to put crippling sanctions on Putin is a powerful warning to China or North Korea, but particularly China, that democracies on one side of the globe care what happened to democracies on the other side. And yes, China would be much harder to sanction than Russia, but nevertheless, I think it's a powerful signal. And the Japanese government and Kishida and Foreign Minister Hayashi completely understand this and have stepped up on Ukraine in important ways. And they're backed by the Japanese public, which is pretty horrified by what they're seeing. So I think this is not in my book very much, but I think the next phase of Japanese diplomacy that's going to be really interesting is what do you call, it's not transatlantic, but the Japan-NATO, Japan-EU relationship is going to be increasingly a part of Japan's playbook and part of Europe's playbook in the other direction, I think.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Mike. I must give the floor to some of my colleagues. Here is Walter Hatch. He says, thank you, Mike. This is great work. I'm now reading By More Than Providence and will read Line of Advantage straight away. As you know, I'm working on AMPO politics now and want to ask this. What is the biggest difference between US and Japanese grand strategies today? I see tremendous overlap. Does this difference represent a significant problem, or how can it be resolved?
So there's a lot of overlap. There's some tactical differences. Japan now, one of the sections of the book, I talk about how Japan under Abe, but on a broader basis than just Abe, is increasingly embracing democracy and democratic norms as an important theme. There's a human rights caucus in the Diet. There's a human rights advisor to Abe. They do that differently from us. They'll sanction China, but they'll be very hesitant to sanction Myanmar because they need Myanmar to deal with China. They're more transactional about it than we are. The Japanese government say we're more messianic than they are. So there are little tactical differences there. On defense and diplomatic strategy, pretty closely aligned. I'd say the biggest divergence right now between the US and Japan is on trade policy. And it's huge, it's gaping. Since the US withdrawal from TPP, since President Trump pulled us out. If you look at surveys by the Lowy Institute in Australia, by the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, experts in Southeast Asia and Australia argue that the Biden administration is more protectionist than the Trump administration. And for some reason, I mean, although he pulled out of TPP, President Trump, for his administration, negotiated a new US, Canada, Mexico, USMCA agreement, which had a digital trade chapter. The US-Japan trade agreement, which was necessary because by pulling out of TPP, President Trump had undercut American agricultural exporters, so we had to do something. But to the credit of the administration, when they negotiated a bilateral trade deal with Japan, they added a chapter on digital trade. So digital trade is an area where Tokyo, the Australians would love to have the US engaged in a broad plurilateral agreement in Asia to set the rules on data reciprocity and digital trade rules as China starts to shape those rules. You know, we've got almost nothing on the table. If you follow the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework the administration put out, it's very, very thin gruel. So there's deep, deep frustration in the Japanese business community and foreign and trade ministries with US economic statecraft right now, because it's basically non-existent. That's a huge gap. It's very ironic. We've sort of switched places with Japan. I personally think this is more of an aberration than a long-term trend in the United States. Polls show robust support for trade among the public. I think that Ukraine and competition with China will add more of a national security imperative to getting trade deals done. But right now, the US is in a very bad place on trade politics. Nobody wants to be the first to propose them in Congress. President Biden doesn't want to propose them. And our allies, and especially Japan, are really frustrated. Japan has stepped into that void by keeping CPTPP going, but that's the biggest interest. And I've read your work over many years, Walter, and it's really interesting for you to look at because it really is kind of a role reversal in between the two countries.
Great, thank you. Let me just also give two students an opportunity to ask you a question, Mike. This is Julie Emery, who was formerly a Japan sister. She's asking about how does cybersecurity fit into Japan's grand strategy from your perspective? Has this changed since the creation of the digital agency? We were just talking about the digital agenda as well.
So Japan was much slower than other US allies, the Five Eyes, Britain, Australia, Canada, much slower to get serious about cybersecurity. 7, 8 years ago, Japan had about 90 people in the government working on cybersecurity. China had tens of thousands. Now Japan is creating cyber commands for the military, the cyber agency, and is getting much more serious and trying to catch up. And one of there are two major imperatives. One is there have been clear cyber attacks, so the evidence of the threat is real. But the other factor is that at a time when Japan has decided it has to be in with the US, it has to be able to operate jointly with the US in contingencies in Asia. And to be clear, the division of roles and missions won't change that much. The US will deliver most of the firepower. Japan will mostly be doing logistical support, mine sweeping. The US is still going to have the more dangerous jobs, but Japan's going to be a lot more engaged, taking more risk. At a time when Abe and the Japanese government have said we're going to do joint planning with the US, we're going to be in. We're not going to have an alibi and say we can't help you in regional crises. We're going to be depending on each other now. We're going to be in this together. At that time, the main message from the Pentagon to the Japanese side was, not if you don't do cyber, because if you can't protect your cyber infrastructure, we can't count on you. Mm-hmm. So the former chairman of the Joint Staff, Admiral Kawano, would say that the number one thing Japan has got to do is actually cyber and space, because in any fight with a peer competitor, they're going to go right at us on cyber and right at us on space. So Japan has a space, not a space force, but they've relaxed the rules on military strategy in space and are working with us as our other key allies to be able to fight if satellites get taken out with small redundant satellites we put up, or GPS that's based on terrain recognition and protecting critical infrastructure. But Japan's playing catch up. It's a high priority. It's a good question. I'm not an expert on cyber, but it's I can barely operate my computer, but it's definitely a priority.
Mm-hmm. I can certainly speak for space, Mike, because that's the thing that I focus on, and they do have a space force. They are very committed to interoperability between the two alliances. Yeah. I have a question here from my PhD student. This is Sung-Hyun Kim. I did tell you he's working on maritime strategy, and he asks, my research also focuses on the changes in Japan's maritime strategy in the 21st century. And I was surprised because your book also focuses on Japan's grand strategy, emphasizing the centrality of the maritime domain. As you mentioned, you focus on changes under the second Abe administration and China's growth as the major driver of those changes. You're arguing that Japan's grand strategy changes are Abe's efforts to respond to the rise of China. So I would like to ask for your opinion regarding the threat of China before Abe. Why then did the shift of Japan's grand strategy started since 2012 under the Abe administration? What happened to China around 2012, making Abe change sort of Japan's grand strategy? Are those changes fundamentally different to changes in the way that it perceived China in the 2000s? I did tell you he's a PhD student.
Yeah, that's a good, I hope that's your prospectus. That's a good topic.
Oh yes, that's prospectus. He's defending it soon.
Okay, well, you still have time to change it based on what I tell you. So in my earlier book, Japan's Reluctant Realism, and when you're writing a historiography and you're looking at history, it's very hard to say this was the critical moment. It's very rare in history that there's a moment where everything changes. Sometimes like 9/11, you think everything changes and then you find out 20 years later it didn't. But to the extent there's a kind of moment in Japan-China relations when things start to change, it's 1994, actually, which when the Chinese test nuclear weapons in Lapnor in their facility. And I have a section on this in my earlier book. And the Japanese and the Chinese had come together in the 1978 treaty of cooperation and friendship. Japan offered yen loans. They agreed together to an anti-hegemony clause, and they were basically worried about the Soviets. And Deng Xiaoping wanted Japanese investment and aid, and Japan wanted Chinese counterweight to keep the Soviets at bay. So they had common purpose, and they brushed over their differences. And in 1994, when the Chinese tested nuclear weapons in a series of tests, Foreign Minister Kono Yohei warned the Chinese that if you keep testing, you're going to put at risk the yen loans and the development assistance we give China. And the Chinese foreign minister's response was, those aren't yen loans, those are reparations.
Mhm.
And the Japanese had never agreed that they were reparations. You know, the historical issues had been brushed under the rug to deal with the Soviet threat and China's economic needs and Japan's desire to have, frankly, more relations with China to counter dependence on the US. There were a lot of reasons for them to brush the history issues under the rug. And so, you know, kind of in that moment and subsequent crises in the Taiwan Straits in 95, the Chinese realized that this history issue no longer constrains Japan. They can't use that to keep Japan down. And the Japanese side realized that economic interdependence does not mean China will do what we want. That we can't shape China's decisions, even when we threaten to cut off development assistance. That's a real turning point, 94. And then, you know, there are subsequent things that happen. What makes 2012 so significant, though, is that's the second Senkaku crisis. And the Chinese sent drones directly over the Senkakus, circumnavigated Japan, very aggressive militarily. And at that time, Abe was out of power. And in early 2012, he began coming back, studying grand strategy, studying Mahan, studying maritime strategy, Kosaka Masataka, and all the greats. And I went to some of his study groups in Tokyo, and he was like, this is what Richard Nixon did when he lost the election to Kennedy in 1960. It's what Winston Churchill did in the 30s when he was out of power. You know, he didn't give up. He kind of prepared for his return, and nobody saw it. And then because China was humiliating Japan within the LDP, Abe was seen as the guy who could restore Japan's pride, the alliance with the US, and push back. So it is no exaggeration to say that Xi Jinping helped make Abe's comeback possible. I don't think Abe would have come back without the 2012 Senkaku crises. So it is, if you're looking for sort of chapters, 2012 is definitely, you're on the right track if you're looking at 2012 as a turning point.
Great. I have a question here from my colleague who asks, did Japan really have a get out of jail card during the Vietnam War? B-52s with American soldiers flew back and forth from Hanoi to Okinawa, and many in Japan were troubled with this involvement.
Yeah, there's no doubt that there were massive anti-war protests in Japan, especially in Okinawa. And you're absolutely right, B-52s. My dad was a Vietnam War era Marine. He did R&R in Okinawa. Japan, we could not have prosecuted the Vietnam War without our bases in Japan. But when the B-52s took off, they would the pilots would open their orders over international airspace and say, oh, what do you know? It's Hanoi today. There were all these sort of artificial constructs put in place so that the Japanese government had deniability. And had no role on the military side. Japan repaired equipment. There was R&R in Japan. There was no military role. The Johnson administration would have loved to have had Japanese troops in Vietnam. They got Korean troops and Australian and some New Zealand troops. They would have loved it, but Japan had no military role, no operational role, no combat role, not even combat logistical support. So that's where the alibi worked. But you're absolutely right. Fire Across the Sea is one of the great histories of the anti-war protests in Japan that I read in grad school, and it was vehement. There was like the United States, there was profound anti-war protests and protests against Japan supporting the US, but the support was bases, not operational. So that was the get out of jail free card. What Abe did was say, it's not just going to be bases, it's going to be operational. There are constraints we can talk about if you like, but when US carriers deploy, when US fighters go out, there will be Japanese ships and submarines right there with them. Maybe not doing the combat, but supporting. That in Vietnam did not happen.
Great. There's somebody here, Mike, someone called Robert Pekkanen, who I don't know who this
Never
person
heard of him.
is. I mean, there's just, he's asking, thanks so much for this talk. I have several students who are working on Japan's DPRK policy. Can you talk a bit about how you see that situation? And they'll appreciate hearing your analysis, especially if you can reflect on what approaches could succeed for Japan in this kind of grand strategy that you are describing.
Yeah, when I said earlier that Japan, under Abe, Japan's approach to Korea was a failure, I meant both Koreas,
Okay.
South Korea and North Korea. I mean, primarily I was thinking about South Korea because in a strategy designed, an external balancing strategy designed to align Asia to resist Chinese coercion, not to contain China, but to resist Chinese coercion, not even trying with South Korea is strategic malpractice. It was the biggest problem. And when I say this and write this, inevitably some shukanshi, some tabloid in Japan, writes an article saying Green is a Korean spy, just sticking up for South Korea. We love all our allies. But North Korea also was not successful. The problem Japan has is that the North Koreans abducted dozens of Japanese citizens. As many of you know, returned 6 of them in the Koizumi years, who chose to stay in Japan against the agreement with the North Koreans, and then North Koreans have not cooperated since. And so it's difficult. The Japanese people want their people back. If you're American, maybe this doesn't resonate on the West Coast as well as the East Coast, but I tell my students, imagine if Cuba took dozens of American kids off the beaches in Miami. We would go to war. And the Japanese aren't going to go to war with North Korea, but understandably, politicians and the public are still outraged and want an accounting. And that's a legitimate and important priority for any Japanese government. Then, of course, they have to worry about North Korea's growing arsenal. Hundreds and hundreds of ballistic missiles capable of hitting Japan, with North Korea has the largest chemical and biological arsenal in the world and one of the largest nuclear arsenals now. And all of that, a lot of experts on scenarios in the Korean Peninsula will tell you the targets for the North Korean nuclear weapons are not South Korea, they're Japan. US bases, it's holding Tokyo at risk. So this is a monumental, almost existential challenge for Japan. But the answer is strengthen relations with South Korea, strengthen US, Japan, Korea trilateral, keep pressure on China to try to hold North Korea accountable, because 90% of North Korean food and fuel comes from China now. So there's a cost to not having a deliberate strategy for shaping the Korean Peninsula in terms of Chinese influence that Japan worries about, but also in terms of dealing with North Korea. But the good news in all of this is, the South Korean election yielded a conservative candidate who wants to improve relations with Japan, who's more hardline on China and North Korea. So Japan has an opportunity now. Just 24 hours ago, the foreign minister designate in the new government, Park Jin, said the comfort women agreement between Japan and China is final. Korea is not going to take back these agreements anymore, and Kishida welcomed that. So there's some early signs, but success with North Korea is going to require strengthening US, Japan, Korea trilateral, keeping pressure on China to keep pressure on North Korea. And of course, there's a diplomatic element. And Abe was willing to meet with Kim Jong-un and willing to have diplomacy, but the North Koreans don't take that seriously. They want something else. They want the US to give them a grand bargain. So it's a very tough position for Japan, but to the extent there's a pathway to success, it's going to have to be cooperation with Seoul and Washington together, not just the US. And maybe, now we're on the cusp of that with the new Korean government.
Fabulous. Mike, one final question. I think it sort of brings us back to what you started off with, centering back on the domestic political environment. And the question is from Robert. He's asking, much has been written about changes in the domestic political environment that has increased the power of the PM. And I think you described that very convincingly, and you've written about that extensively. Could you reflect on what mattered relatively more in terms of domestic institutional change? Was it individual political leadership, Abe, no Abe, or was it really the international situation? It's the question that your
social science question. Structure or agency, right?
Right, exactly.
Was it structure or agency?
Right.
So as a historian, I want to say agency and leadership. But as a political scientist, I want to say structure. I think one of my PhD students asked me the question in one of my book conferences, what if there had been no Abe? What if Abe had never come along? Would there have been this grand strategy? And my answer was yes. The elements would have all been there. because I believe that structure matters, and that the pressure on Japan's interests, technological, economic values, maritime security, was so great that this combination of internal balancing, external balancing, strengthening the alliance with the US would have happened. Abe's predecessor, of course, as Robert knows well, was Prime Minister Noda, the last Democratic Party of Japan prime minister. He wanted to do essentially everything Abe wanted to do. He couldn't, because the DPJ was so divided over ideological issues. So the answer is, if there had been no Abe, somebody would have come along and started building this house. But the bricks would not have been neatly laid. The cement would not have been as good. It would have been a less sturdy construction. So that's maybe a cop-out, but that's the answer. Where Abe mattered was consolidating it with a strategic vision and a sense of historical purpose, and an ability to sustain the way he couldn't first time as prime minister, an ability to sustain public support for 8 years to get this done. Other leaders wouldn't have had the same longevity, wouldn't have had the same deliberateness, and so it would have been a sloppier and less efficient strategy. But I think if you look at Noda, and you look at the other people who sort of would like to replace Abe, the building blocks would have been similar, I think.
Yeah. Mike, I'm so sorry. I missed one question. So if you could just answer this last one. I think it follows from what you are actually saying. It's about the 2015 demonstrations showed that the Japanese public was very concerned about changing Article 9 of the Constitution, as well as other aspects of Abe's security policy. Is the Japanese public, in your estimation, still concerned with Japan's remilitarization and growing involvement in global security matters? If so, would this ever be a significant restraint on Japan's grand strategy? I think that's a great question for you.
Yeah, it is a good question. And the answer is yes, it's a significant, the word I use is undertow, to what Abe and others have tried to do to push forward this more deliberate and proactive grand strategy. That pacifism is not dead at all. The Japanese people do not like war. That hasn't changed. They do not like war. I would say there's more realism in the Japanese public and the Diet. They don't like war, but as Trotsky said, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And the Japanese public realize, and polls show this, that it's a dangerous world. And that Japan needs alliances, it needs defense spending. The self-defense forces are the most respected institution in Japan in polls today. They need these institutions, they need these alliances, not because they love war, because the Japanese people still hate war. And what happened in 2015 with the legislation was Abe and the LDP heard great enthusiasm about the legislation from the LDP rank and file. And they assumed the opposition DPJ was weak. But the opposition parties very cleverly came up with simple one-line attacks. They said, your children will be drafted. And so the LDP and the government was finding itself saying, no, there's no draft in this. And they just lost the narrative. And their strategy for explaining it was not effective. And they were a bit stunned at the blowback. And the opinion polls were roughly 50-50 when it passed. But today, no major political leader in Japan is talking about turning it back the clock and undoing it, including the head of the Rikento, the leadership of the and even the Socialist Party. No one in the LDP. So it is now a fact, and the Japanese political leadership and media and public accept it, and I think accept it as necessary. But anti-war culture in Japan, anti-war sentiment is still very, very strong. I think it's tempered now by a realism about what is necessary to prevent war and to deter. And I went to Tokyo University in the late 80s. There was one professor at Todai, Satoshi Zaburo, who was kind of interested in national security. And then there was like one at Tsukuba University. That was it. You go to Sophia, Waseda, Keio, any Japanese university, and you will find more people working on national security than at the University of Washington. I mean, you'll find more young scholars in their 30s and 40s who want to do this stuff. So culturally now, including in the academy, there's debate. There's still Marxists, there's still pacifists, but there's much more space for younger scholars to work on this. And it's not that they love war. It's anti-militarism. What I would say is anti-war sentiment is strong. Anti-militarism sentiment has faded. There's a realism about what is necessary in a dangerous world. So that's sort of how I'd characterize it. But this is one of the hardest things about Japan studies, because as Carol Gluck from Columbia University, brilliant historian, says, Japanese culture masks change. It's conservative, and change in Japan is cleverly hidden. And so measuring change and non-change in Japan is always challenging. And there's always a little bit of both. But the culture of anti-militarism has faded. The culture of anti-war is still pretty strong, I'd say, which may seem like a contradiction, but I'd say it's not.
I think that brings your historical and political science training very nicely together, thinking about what kinds of things we're thinking about in the past that are informing the way to the future. Thank you, Mike, for such a great overview of Japan's grand strategy. On behalf of the University of Washington and the Patricia and Griffith Way lecture series, thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you all. And Ellen, I will hand things over to you for final words. Thank you.
Thanks, Sajja.
Thank you. I think I will, although you can hear me, you probably cannot see me. Oh, there we go. Hold on. I do want to say thank you very much to Michael Green for joining us. It was a very illuminating talk, and I look forward to reading the book. I want to thank everybody for attending. Please do check out the Japan Studies website for more upcoming events like this, and to check back in for the recording if there were pieces of it you didn't catch and would like to hear again another time. Thank you, Sadia Pekkanen. Thank you, Marie Antrodogi. And thank you again, Michael Green. Good night.
Thank you all.